Thanks for checking out part 12 in my series on the history of comic book adaptations to film. 2008 was a watershed year for comic book movies, and this is in large part due to The Dark Knight, which is unquestionably one of the most influential comic book films ever made. It proved without a doubt that superhero films could be serious, critically acclaimed films. Before The Dark Knight, comic movies could get a good critical reception, but were still generally seen as just entertaining popcorn films. Christopher Nolan changed that, and his film got 8 Oscar nominations, the most ever for a comic book adaptation. It won in 2 of those categories, one being sound editing, and the other win was Heath Ledger for Best Supporting Actor, one of only 2 posthumous acting wins in Academy history. It was also the first time a comic book movie had won an acting Oscar, or for that matter, any major Oscar at all. The other nominations were mainly in technical categories, and Wally Pfister got one for the cinematography, just like for Batman Begins. The Dark Knight did not get a nomination for Best Picture, however. This ended up being one of the most notable snubs in Oscar history, and was considered emblematic of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences being out of touch with the average filmgoer. Next year, the Academy switched to 10 nominees for the Best Picture category, and many claimed that The Dark Knight was responsible. The Dark Knight was equally successful commercially. It had a moderately sized budget at $185 million, but it made over $1 billion. It was only the 4th film to reach this mark, and it's still the 28th highest grossing film ever. It solidified Christopher Nolan's reputation as one of the foremost filmmakers of our time, both in the eyes of moviegoers and critics. This film was such a cultural phenomenon that other comic book films are often compared to it even to this day. When the first trailers for Iron Man 3 were released, many fans thought they were trying to put out a tone similar to The Dark Knight, but the third Iron Man ended up bearing little resemblance to Nolan's film. Like the first film in the eventual trilogy, The Dark Knight was faithful to the source material in some ways, while differing in others. 2 graphic novels that were cited as major influences were Alan Moore's 1988 one-shot The Killing Joke, drawn by Brian Bolland, and The Long Halloween. The Long Halloween was published beginning in 1996 and was written by Jeff Loeb and illustrated by Tim Sale. The Joker is vaguely similar to the source material, but some details have been changed. In the comics, he's permanently white due to falling in a chemical vat. This incident is never alluded to in the film, and there's a scene showing the Joker without his white makeup. The other villain in the film is Two-Face, played by Aaron Eckhart, and again Nolan's version is vaguely similar to the comic counterpart. The main difference is that Two-Face doesn't really have a split personality in The Dark Knight, which is sort of his defining characteristic. Originally, he was just going to be Harvey Dent in this film, only to be scarred in the third one. Instead, his storyline was condensed into one film. The villain of Batman Begins, the Scarecrow, played a minor role, making Cillian Murphy the first actor to reprise a part as a Batman villain on film. Another comic book adaptation from 2008 ended up being perhaps as influential as The Dark Knight, and that was Marvel Studios' Iron Man. This was the first movie from Marvel's in-house studio, and the first installment of what would go on to become the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the first major example of an interconnected cinematic superhero universe, something which is now being imitated by multiple studios. The MCU has been a massive success, with 14 films so far making almost a whopping $11 billion at the box office, with at least 9 more currently on the way, and there have been 6 television shows as well. Obviously, a connected universe proved lucrative, but none of it may have occurred without the success of Iron Man. A somewhat unlikely director was chosen in Jon Favreau. Originally an actor, he wrote and directed his first feature film in 2001, Made, a crime comedy starring Favreau and Vince Vaughn. His only other directorial effort before Iron Man was the 2003 Will Ferrell comedy Elf. This is not exactly the resume that would usually lead to getting a superhero blockbuster, but Marvel Studios would go on to make a lot of decisions like this in the future. Favreau would later direct Iron Man 2, The Jungle Book, and Cowboys and Aliens. Iron Man was a huge commercial success. It was moderately budgeted at $140 million, but the opening weekend alone of $100 million was almost enough to make that back. The final tally ended up being $585 million. The reviews were very good as well, and it has an impressive 94% on Rotten Tomatoes. Undoubtedly the main reason for the film's success was its star Robert Downey Jr., as he perfectly portrays the wisecracking Tony Stark. The rest of the cast was solid as well, and Downey has good chemistry with Gwyneth Paltrow as his love interest Pepper Potts. Jeff Bridges is awesome as usual as Obadiah Stane, the villain, and Terrence Howard is not bad as James Rhodes, although he was replaced in the sequel by Don Cheadle. Iron Man also featured a cameo by Samuel L. Jackson in an after-credit scene where he plays Nick Fury, the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. Fury was originally white in the comics, but in the Ultimate Universe he looks exactly like Jackson. The after-credit scene set up the Avengers Initiative, hinting at the future team-up, and was written by famed comic author Brian Michael Bendis. Overall, the film was pretty faithful to the source material. One of the few major deviations was changing the location of Stark becoming Iron Man from Vietnam to Afghanistan, but this makes sense as a way of modernizing the story. Also in the comics, Jarvis is a butler, but in the film, Jarvis is the name of Stark's talking AI system, but it would eventually be revealed that the AI was based on an actual butler. The second entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe would end up being The Incredible Hulk, with a version that was unrelated to the 2003 Ang Lee movie Hulk. It's also not an origin story like so many other superhero films, and relates the accident that made Bruce Banner the Hulk in the opening credits. The movie was the fourth directed by Frenchman Louis Leterrier, having previously made Transporter, Transporter 2, and Unleashed. He would later direct Now You See Me in Clash of Titans, and The Incredible Hulk is his best effort out of the ones I've seen. Edward Norton was chosen to portray the title character, and the excellent Tim Roth is his nemesis Emil Blonsky, aka The Abomination. In the film, he doesn't really go by this moniker, but is simply referred to as an abomination at one point. Liv Tyler played the love interest Betty Ross, and William Hurt filled the role of her father, Thunderbolt Ross. The only connective tissue to Iron Man was a post-credits scene involving Tony Stark talking to William Hurt's character. After this, viewers would expect some sort of after-credits scene in all the Marvel Studios films. The character of the Hulk went on to appear in The Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron, but Edward Norton was replaced by Mark Ruffalo. This was unfortunate in terms of continuity, but probably worked out for the best. Norton gave a rather serious performance as Banner, and might not have fit in with the more lighthearted tone of the Avengers. It also might have been difficult balancing Norton's ego with the rest of the main cast. The Incredible Hulk gave a decent showing at the box office, but was still slightly disappointing. It failed to double its $150 million budget, making only $263 million worldwide. Next, we have The Spirit, based on the comic by legendary writer and artist Will Eisner. Eisner started writing in the 1930s and became well known for his work on The Spirit. In the 70s, he started working in longer forms, eventually leading to the conception of the term graphic novel. He continued to publish work up until his death in 2005. In the 1970s, Academy Award winner William Friedkin, who directed The French Connection and The Exorcist, was considering making a film out of the character of the Spirit, but it fell through. The Spirit comics are awesome, but unfortunately the adaptation was atrocious. It was Frank Miller's first solo directorial effort after co-directing Sin City with Robert Rodriguez. Miller unwisely chose to apply the high-contrast green screen aesthetics of that film to Eisner's world. The Spirit was a massive flop. It only grossed $39 million globally, far less than the budget of $60 million. The critics were equally harsh, and it has an abysmal 14% on Rotten Tomatoes. Perhaps Miller should have learned a lesson from the Sin City film and realized that it's better to stay true to the source material. Wanted was a limited comic series published in 2003 and 2004. It had art by J.G. Jones and was written by Mark Miller, who wrote the Marvel crossover Civil War and Kick-Ass, which was made into a movie itself in 2010. The filmed adaptation of Wanted was released in 2008. It was the first American film directed by Timur Bekmambetov, as he was previously known for the Russian-language movies Night Watch and its sequel Day Watch. He went on to direct Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter and the 2016 version of Ben-Hur that failed with critics and audiences. I haven't read the comic, but apparently the film is not faithful to the source material. Wanted was quite successful. It made over $340 million on a budget of only about $75 million. It also received mostly positive reviews from critics. I personally found it to be pretty average, and the whole idea of curving bullets is silly and ridiculous. James McAvoy's career had just broken through in 2007 with his acclaimed performance in Atonement, and this was his first leading role in a big action movie. After this, he would of course be the younger version of Professor X in 3 X-Men films to date. Among Wanted's supporting cast were Angelina Jolie, Morgan Freeman, rapper Common, and General Zod himself, Terrence Stamp. Guillermo del Toro returned to the director's chair for his sequel, Hellboy II: The Golden Army. Most of the cast came back, including Ron Perlman, Selma Blair, and Doug Jones. David Hyde Pierce, who did the voice for Abe Sapien in the first installment, was not in this. Instead, Doug Jones provided the voice in addition to the body for Abe. Seth MacFarlane of Family Guy also voiced a character. Whether or not Hellboy 2 would even be made was in doubt, but Del Toro had just come off the success of his Spanish-language movie Pan's Labyrinth. This allowed him to go to work on the second Hellboy film. It was mildly successful as it doubled its $80 million budget and got good reviews from critics. Hellboy 2 is very entertaining and easily the best of the smaller 2008 comic book movies. Next, we come to Punisher Warzone, which was considered a soft reboot of the first Punisher film. It didn't contradict anything that happened in it, but didn't really have any strong connections either. The origin of the Punisher wasn't redone, but Thomas Jane was replaced by Ray Stevenson. Warzone is much darker and more violent than the Thomas Jane version, and was probably the most violent Marvel film at the time. The director was German Lexi Alexander, who also made Green Street Hooligans and episodes of Arrow and Supergirl. She did a poor job here as the film ended up being pretty terrible. It made a measly $10 million worldwide, far below its modest budget of $35 million. The critics also blasted Warzone, and it has a rating of only 27% on Rotten Tomatoes. Warzone is a huge step down from the previous Punisher film, and there hasn't been a theatrical version of the character since. He's only appeared in the Netflix series Daredevil. You may not think of Speed Racer as being a comic book property, but the characters first appeared in manga form, so it qualifies. The manga was first published in 1958, and the US TV show first aired in 1967. A live-action version was in development since 1992. The movie adaptation was directed by the Wachowskis. This was the first film they made after the Matrix trilogy, and their first that wasn't rated R. The cast included Emile Hirsch, Christina Ricci, Susan Sarandon, John Goodman, and Matthew Fox. The film flopped spectacularly, making only $93 million globally, not enough to even make back its budget of $120 million. Reviews were mostly negative, leading to a 39% score on Rotten Tomatoes. While I understand why many don't like it, and acknowledge its glaring flaws, I personally found Speed Racer to be entertaining and worth watching for its stunning visuals alone. That's all for this one. Keep an eye out for Part 13 covering the year 2009 coming soon.